Hi guys, good morning. Thank you for joining us for our Optimize Your Salesforce Data Migration Strategy webinar. I'm just going to give it a couple minutes for people to trickle in and then we'll get started. All right, thank you guys. And for those who've just joined, welcome and thank you for joining. Before we get started, let's go over a couple of housekeeping messages. You're all muted, but always feel free to raise your hand and I'll be happy to unmute you. If you don't want to speak up, you can always ask your questions in our question box and we'll be recording and you'll get a copy of this recording tomorrow. Let me introduce our speakers for today. I've got with me Reese, who is the Director of Revenue Operations and has been in the Salesforce ecosystem for 7 years. And with her is Jay. He is the Director of Technical Services and has been around for 14 years. Before we really get started, I'd love to just kind of get a sense of who the audience is. So I created a little poll to see what your role is. All right. Give it a couple more seconds, but it looks like we have a pretty even split between solution architect and Salesforce admins. And with that, I'll close the poll and have Reese take over from here.
Sure. Morning, good evening, good day, wherever you guys are at. All right, so I'm going to start off by giving you a bunch of information that I've learned along the way regarding just data migration and how to prepare for that. You know, there are people that are total data geeks like myself, and there are other people that don't understand the importance of data. So we want to do here today is talk about why it's important, how you can prepare for a data migration, how you can, more importantly, maintain that data using governance plan and a lot of other tools that we'll talk through here with these slides. So to start, how to prepare for it. So creating a robust data governance plan is probably the most important thing you can do for this whole process. So what that means is, you know, a lot of people will immediately start to search for the tool that they need to do the migration, but there's a lot of work that goes into a good data migration plan prior to finding that specific tool. So the data governance plan is something that you're going to employ to understand the quality of your data, what you need out of your data, how you manage your data, who manages it, you know, when changes happen, all sorts of things. So these are the types of topics you want to think through and create this plan that everyone agrees to before you actually do the migration itself. You know, so that brings you to the outline for your data migration project. A lot of things that I just mentioned. Who's involved? You've got, of course, your tech team who's going to do the work, your admins, maybe your solution architects, developers are a part of this. But you also want to include the business. And the reason you want to do that is because we can move data all over the place, but if your users don't understand what that data looks like, why it looks the way it is, then there's no point to doing the migration anyway. So it's really important to involve the right stakeholders in this. And I would advise that you have definitely at least one or two stakeholders, you know, maybe probably at the director level. I would say at least a manager, because they're the ones that are, you know, sort of speaking up and down all the time, up to VPs, up to your C-level, and then all the way down to your individual contributors who are the ones on the ground doing the work. So for all of those sorts of levels of the business, and not only that, other departments as well, understanding why the data is designed, your data model is designed the way it is really important. And that will directly inform how you build your data migration plan. So you definitely want to approach it from that angle. Backing up data, always a super fun one. Some orgs are going to have 100,000 records. Some orgs are going to have 10 million records. So understanding what the right approach to backing up your data is extremely important before you go ahead and make changes. I mean, that goes for any type of change in Salesforce, but we'll speak specifically to backing up that data. And a few tools that you can use, a few tricks that you can use to make it easy to do a rollback if you run up against some issues that were not anticipated. And it's another way to ensure that you have information kept in a second place, right? We want to do that with all of our stuff. Think about for me, I back up all my photos to 2 different places. Same concept with data. You want to do that for the business so you can confidently speak to anyone to say, yeah, we have control over our data, where it is at all times, and we have it in more than one place in case we need to access it. There's that. And then auditing and cleansing the data. This is the never-ending struggle for someone in operations like myself. We understand, again, how important it is. And, we want the business to understand this as well, and why they need to play a role in keeping that data clean and helping to maintain that integrity. But also there's the audit piece, which should be sort of a preemptive step to the cleansing, because you can turn on a data, you can buy a data integrity tool all you want, but if no one's keeping an eye on that, then again, you're kind of wasting money there, and there's no structure around it. So like, what's the point, right? So you're auditing. You could, my team has dashboards where we keep an eye on the data points that matter, and these are data points that matter to help our sales team sell, help our marketing team market, and those are the ones we focus on keeping really clean and up to date. And we use both tools to do that, but also we try to put responsibility on our users as well. So how to prepare for it? That's pretty much what it comes to. Your governance plan, we'll go back to this. This is, again, one of the most important pieces of the overall data migration plan. You need to understand what you're working with. So for example, when I first came into Prodly, the first thing I did was just dive in. I think anybody on this call knows how exciting and frustrating it is to get your hands on a brand new org and see what is going on in there. So the first thing you're going to do is current state. Like, you just need to know where you're at, because that's gonna tell you where you need to go. So definitely want to get your team in there, do an analysis, find out how many. We'll use CPQ as an example. What are your price rules? What are your product rules? Are they active? Are they in use? Are they effective? You kind of want to figure out, in terms of the data that matters, what's the current state. And then I would also add in here too, well, let me talk about that in a minute. Assigning roles and responsibilities. So who actually plays a role in this governance plan? Back to, getting buy-in from the business. You really want to have users that are assigned not for a single migration project, but for an overall governance plan. I would say there would be, the admins on my team, I would have them take care of the auditing piece. Like, I'd like you guys to look every week at a dashboard that we create to maintain that data integrity and make sure we fix anything that's not right. And then we would expect the business to come to us if something is not right with the reporting they're looking at, or if they need more reporting. So the governance plan really is like an umbrella concept of how you manage your data and how that data works for the business. Developing your plan. This is a fun one. There's like 1 million ways to plan anything, right? Like, you can use tools outside of Salesforce. You can use Salesforce. Point is, you want to get a plan in place, almost like a checklist, being part of it, where each time you're changing or moving that data, you can refer to this plan, and this is the plan that just totally guides the entire effort of your data, whether it's migration, data hygiene, changes, anything like that. So that plan really needs to be the master, and everyone needs to agree to it and then adhere to it, and that's going to be the key in deploying all the rest of these solutions that we're talking about. Addressing data protection and privacy. This one I try to avoid, just like everyone else, but we absolutely have to pay attention to it. It can be difficult to understand, though there are a lot of resources out there for it. So what I would say to that is, you absolutely need to address it. You need to take time to understand what your responsibilities are in the role that you are in, and what the entirety of the organization's responsibilities are. To address GDPR, to the rules coming out and the guidelines out of California, it's coming, it's not going to stop, and it is going to become a very important, or it is becoming a very important piece of managing data. So that's something you definitely want to look into and see which of these apply to the data that I'm moving. If you're moving a product rule in CPQ, a little less of a concern there than if you're moving lead and contact information. So it kind of depends on the data you're working on and the level of privacy and data protection that you need to become familiar with and make sure you're following those guidelines. And those are out there. They're all over online, so it's easy to find. Monitoring for success and areas of improvement. Cool. So now you've got a plan together. Like, so what? You've got to the last step there is really to figure out how you define success in your data governance plan. And this could be anything from ongoing monitoring and maintenance to changes to your CPQ data that enable your sales team to sell a more robust package or sell a brand new product model or something to that effect. So as part of this plan, you're always looking and trying to find out, like, why are we doing this? How do we know we're doing it well? If you don't do it well, if there's a lot of problems, do a postmortem, talk about what you did that did not work, what you learned from it, and what you're going to do differently next time. So it's this cyclical process that you will go through all the time, governed by this governance plan. So outlining it, the scope creep is about as fun as privacy policies. However, also critical. So going into this, it can be really exciting, especially if you get your hands on a newer tool or you've got a tool that you love and it's easy and you love to use it and you've done it before, you're super familiar with it. And then Monday morning, you start this new data migration project. If you don't understand your scope, you're going to miss something, something's going to break. You're going to do too much and waste your time. None of these things are awesome. So you want to make sure as part of your particular project within your governance plan that you understand the scope of exactly what you're doing. And is this something that you're doing repetitively? Are you deploying monthly? Is this a one-time data migration? Do you need to update a project that's an ongoing project that you're working on all the time and update that scope? So, I really suggest writing it all down because once you really get going on it and your focus is on the data migration project, there's so many small pieces and nuances that if you're not organized with all the things we're talking about today, it can easily get out of hand, and that's where defining your scope is super important. Your timeline, right? Everything's got a timeline. What are the expectations of the business? What are the realistic timelines that you as a professional and understanding what a data migration takes? What can you commit to? Make sure everyone agrees on that. Your stakeholders, everyone that has their assigned roles and responsibilities should definitely know what the expected timeline is before any buttons get clicked. Migration tools and methods. There's like a whole bunch of them. So we're going to dive into some of those today, but understanding which tools are best for which, what your goals are for the migration project when you take into account scope, timeline, the data that you're working with. There's any number of migration tools and methods that you can use. Some are better than others. We'll talk about that as well. So another big one is going to be backing up your data outside of production. This one is important, and there's no great, in my opinion, awesome solution for this that everyone has to use. It can be tricky because, again, you have some orgs that have 100,000 records, and then you have some orgs that have 10 million records. So understanding why you're doing a data backup, when you should do it, all these things are best practices we want to keep in mind. And also this goes as deep as SLAs and things with your enterprise customers. There may be some terms in your contracts with them that dictate how you back up your data, where your data is kept, and all these things. So you definitely want to make yourself aware of if there are any custom terms in any of your contracts with your customers that would dictate how or when or anything like that around where your data is backed up. And there's a few methods that are go-tos. So a go-to method for backing up your data outside of production, right? Because you want those 2 copies. It's going to be a manual export. So you can either create a report of data that you want to back up. And, a good question is, well, what data do you want to back up? That's entirely up to the business. I would propose something like your standard objects, of course, your accounts, your contacts, perhaps your leads even. Cases could be important as well. There's a lot of different things, campaigns, all sorts of stuff like that. Definitely, again, we'll go back to CPQ as an easy example. All of your rules and everything that you have in place, CPQ is complex. So you want to make sure you've got a backup of your current state. So you can do that with a report. Build a report, you can export that report. You can use data loader to export just a raw CSV. It's pretty powerful. There's it's a bit clunky, as I would imagine everyone on this call is familiar with, but it's the way to do it. You can use disaster recovery apps. This is more of a less of a maintenance motion and more of a something terrible has happened. We need a tool to be able to respond to that and restore our data to keep business moving. And then there's the concept. And so when you do the disaster recovery, I've seen data being stored in places outside of Salesforce when you do that. So manual export to CSV with data loader and disaster recovery apps enable you to move that data outside of Salesforce entirely, store it somewhere else. Copy to a sandbox. Literally, you can move data from one box to another. So you can move data with a tool like Prodly, which Jay will touch on in a little bit. Couple clicks of the button, and you move it from a data set you've created from Prodly from production over to a sandbox of your choosing. Could be partial, could be a Dev Pro, depends on the amount of data you're trying to move and back up. So there's more than one way to do it, and really, again, like what the goal is going to dictate how you do that. The volume of records and data that you're trying to move is also going to inform that. And is this a maintenance function? Is this a disaster recovery plan? Can that data leave Salesforce or not? Or do you want it to? What are you going to do with that backup of your data? So all of these things are things you need to consider when deciding the best method for backing up data outside of production. Clean your data before you migrate it. Right, we talked about this before. Again, as ops and Salesforce folks, we generally understand how important it is to have good data for a whole lot of reasons. So as part of a larger data migration project and governance plan, the quality of your data matters, and there's a whole lot of reasons for this. So we'll go through these. A lot of these are seem like no-brainers, but let's still touch on them. It's the plan: deprecate outdated data. So what that means is something, for example, a lot of places I've seen will remove tasks, actually delete them, or export them, back them up, and delete them, depending how you need to do it, because after like a year. So tasks are one of the culprits where you've got the largest volume of data eating up your system resources and limits there. So deprecate it, get it out of the way. It's probably useless if no one's looked at it in a year or modified it or anything. You probably don't need it. Resolve your duplicates. There's a lot of good duplicate tools out there, but the idea is that will minimize the amount of data you have. One of the risks of duplicates is that you're working off 2 different records. You don't have a holistic view of that actual, we'll say a contact, for example. If you've got a contact, 2 contacts for the same person on an account, which unfortunately happens far too often, your one rep could be working off of one record, and an SDR or BDR could be working off the other. So if you go in there to look at it, you don't know what the other, what's going on in the other record. So you want to make sure all that data is put together so you have the most up-to-date information there that you can have. And that will also affect your storage if you've got a lot of duplicates, which honestly most people do have. So correcting data entry errors, so spelling and punctuation. This one can be tedious, but also well worth it because, for example, if you spell, okay, I'll tell you, I've seen this before where you've got the name of an account spelled incorrectly. And so when sales goes to generate an order form or quote, it may pull that in. And then you look kind of silly sending off a quote or an order form to a company where you can't even spell their name right, So as fun as it is to go in and really monitor spelling and punctuation, it's really important. And same thing, using like a naming convention. So like if you decide as a company that you're going to put the LLC at the end of a company name, you got to make sure all the accounts that are LLCs have that. Or if you're not doing that, make sure they don't, because that could affect duplicate rules and things like that too, depending on how you're looking for and matching data and managing data. Formatting, for address fields and phone numbers, Salesforce gives you standard fields for those. Use them. If for some reason you can't use those, make sure if you're putting in the past I put another, believe it or not, phone field custom on a contact. You use the right type or data type field instead of just putting a text field, because then it can get all wrong. And if someone goes to click to dial, let's say an SDR goes to click to dial and that's not the right format, it won't work and it's frustrating. So it's going to affect your user adoption as well when you're not using the right data types and formatting. Let's see, develop and enforce naming conventions. Yes, just said it. I'll say it again. Develop and enforce naming conventions. Super important to reporting, to lots of things. Like I said, merging data using tools like Composer if you're generating documents to send out, or DocuSign for things that you're sending out. There's just a million reasons why you should keep things consistent, and it really goes to scalability. If you actually use things correctly, it's pretty much infinitely scalable. If you do not, it just creates a mess that you constantly have to clean up and essentially waste your time. And then filling in data that's missing from your records. It's a good idea to keep an eye on if you use industry, for example, on the account record to dictate maybe territory assignment. If you're missing that data, those records are not going to get assigned to the correct sales reps, and they could very well miss an opportunity to sell into an account because it's missing the data that the automation is using to do territory assignment or something like that. So you really want to make sure the data that matters is filled in. Again, use a tool for it. There's a lot of them out there that are pretty decent. And also keep that audit going. Have your ops team have an auditing dashboard that they're monitoring all the time. And the data types, again, make sure your data types are correct. I've said it 2-3 times here. Cool. So this is a fun one. This is where it starts to get super technical. So what you want to do is make migrating relational data as efficient as possible. And the reason for this is there are many child relationships that cannot be records can't be created until the parent's there. So the order in which you're doing this migration really matters. So what you want to do is you want to start at the top, right? You want that parent record to be the first thing that you look at in terms of migrating data. One of the best tips that I can give you, and I know this from experience of not doing it this way, is to create a text field to store the original record ID for each record, because when you move data between environments, it will be assigned a brand new record ID. All record IDs are unique. So one of the reasons that this is important is that if anything goes wrong during the deployment, or if you need to reference something later on to understand maybe a slight change in data or something, you can always go and grab that original record ID and go to the environment where that data was originally stored, and you can easily just plug it in the URL and pull up the original record that created this new record, so you can do your comparison. Super powerful in terms of VLOOKUPs and other Excel functions and things like that as well. And the same thing with the user ID. Any ID that is important to you, like user ID, if you're wanting to maintain the same record ownership, for any number of reasons, you want to map that as well in the same way. You just put, the way I do it is just say legacy record ID or legacy, user ID or whatever. And these fields you can keep on there, which I advise. If you have a stricter change management process and creating fields is not a great option, you can always create these just so you can do, I would argue that it's the most effective way to do an audit afterwards to ensure that your migration plan went off well. And then you can delete those fields. I mean, really, it's for your reference, so they don't have to be there. It just helps you out in the process of the migration. So go ahead and then you would upload your parent records in. And then once you put them in, because of that new ID, you gotta pull them right back out with the brand new ID. Because then you need to work on the child. This is actually a great diagram on this slide, which is you need to hook up. So we'll use accounts and contacts again as an example. So you put your account records in, and then you export them again with the new ID. And then you go to your child record, and you take that legacy ID from the legacy source, and then you take the new ID, and then you match up the child records, the contact record, to the new parent record. And from there, you can go ahead and just upload, again, those contacts right to the account. It does take some time, though. It can be frustrating. It's depending on how many records you have. If you have 5, then this is no problem, but if you do have many, you will find the reason I would suggest using a tool for larger data migrations is that you do hit limits, both in Salesforce with sharing, which I think we'll get to a little bit later, but also in Excel or G Sheets or whatever you're using. Like, they are not built to handle millions of records. So you're going to hit slowdowns, things are going to freeze, things are going to crash. So it's just something to keep in mind when you're thinking about your data migration, your overall governance plan. Do you have an org with enough data that requires you to use a tool that can handle a lot more records, or does G Sheets, does Excel work for you? And then, so if you have more than one level of relationships, you're going to need to go through that same motion again, where you export the child and the parent, you match those up, and then you continue through the the remaining. You can go, as you can see here, parent, child, grandchild, great-grandchild. So you basically, the point is that you want to maintain the original IDs, and then you'll have to use a tool to export those all those records, match them up, and then reinsert them and insert the new records as you go through. So extremely time consuming. I think the way this kind of goes is the way I've seen this, and I don't know if it's the best way or not. I think it's the way that people do it because it's the status quo, but an organization will try and do it. So you've got some developer, or you've got some admins or whoever on your ops team, and so they go through this motion and they do it, and it takes like all day, and they just are super unhappy about it. So eventually they go, okay, let's just pay a consultant to do it. And so then you go drop a bunch of money on a consultant to do it, and it gets done. It takes forever, fine, it costs a lot of money, and you do that for a little while, but then you realize, like, this is something we're going to need ongoing, and the bigger we get, you get another round of funding. It's just like, we need a tool that we can manage to do this, because this is so important now as we're growing and we're looking towards the future. Are we gonna acquire their companies? Are we gonna get acquired? Are we trying to go IPO? What are we doing? We need to have super tight control over our data. And so then, kind of at that point is where you look for a really good tool to help with this whole process, because this is just how it's been done for so long, and it's tedious. Cool. Masking sensitive data. This goes back to the protection, regulations we're starting to see in the industry. So, Salesforce has really been great about keeping up with the regulations, I think, and providing basic solutions for us. So what we want to do is, when we are doing data migrations and thinking about a governance plan, we need to have something in place. And I mentioned this earlier, where we can comfortably move data around without worrying about breaking the law. So a great way to do that is we're going to replace the sensitive data by anonymizing it. specifically when you're moving it from one org to another. And that's really important to do. And so having a solution in place for that is something you definitely want to make part of your governance plan, because at some point some auditor is going to ask about it. If not an actual customer or prospect who wants to know about, what do you do with my data? How do you manage it? So it's super important to have an answer to that question and to employ that solution as you're migrating data. So yeah, when you've got a security breach, and if data is compromised in a non-production org, this is going to minimize that risk of disclosing that confidential data. Regulatory compliance, just what I was talking about. Insider threat. So say there's somebody that's super unhappy with your company, they could just take all, or they're happy, but they got a better offer somewhere else. There's little you can do to stop them from exporting data and taking it with them. So you kind of want to have a plan in place so that anytime data is moving, it's anonymized. External parties, just bad actors coming in and trying to hack. And data encryption is not similar to data masking. So basically, a Salesforce data mask, is a paid Salesforce product that can mask the data in the environment. So depending on your use case, and I won't talk too much to it because I don't want to give you the wrong information, because it really depends on your use case. But I would say go out there, do a little bit of research on data encryption versus Salesforce data mask, see which one is the better option for you based on what your requirements are. Cool. All right, so considering, your source control for data changes, is this a J slide or am I still going? Is it mine?
Jay,
Okay.
want to speak to this?
Well, we can probably both talk through this a little bit here, but there's always the what happens when something goes wrong. So nothing's perfect. There's a lot of moving parts. Reese did a really good explanation of all the things that are involved in moving data around, all those children, the remapping, the IDs. So what if something doesn't happen that you intended it to? There are not a whole lot of ways to roll those changes back. Or somebody might overwrite someone else's work, or there's just a lot of moving parts, a lot of hands in the kitchen when you're talking about these data changes and deployments in here. So really the crux of this is there are ways to use things other than Salesforce for your source of truth. Consider using a source control, maybe a repo, maybe you're backing up that data as Reese talked about. Maybe there's a way to utilize something where you can back up the data and use it to roll back from as well. There's a lot of possibilities out there to think through, and this goes back to your governance plan. You're planning at the beginning. Who's doing what? What's the plan look like? There's not an easy way manually to merge or clone changes to more than one org at a time. So now you're dealing with 3 different environments with 3 different sets of record IDs. No economy of scale on that. You're going to track all of those record IDs and all those individual environments. But the most important piece here is you want to deliver faster, more frequent releases. You want to move quicker. You want to be agile. You want to do time to value, bring things to market as quick as you can. How do you mitigate the risks that go along with that? There's some considerations here, and I'll tap into this a little bit more at the very end, true source control for data, but kind of teasing it and maybe dangling that carrot right now. However, as you move ahead, Shannon, I'll take this next one here too. We can do some source controlling without actual source control or version control or a repo in here. I know this slide is a lot to look at. There's arrows going in every which way here, every which way but loose, but starting at the top there on the right-hand side, essentially this is saying that staging can become your source of truth. Production should be its own silo. Protect production. People are working in there. That's where you're generating things from. But you can use solutions, or maybe you use staging, which could be a full sandbox, maybe a partial, if you want to leverage it that way, to actually be your source control, your source of truth for everything below that. So don't let those lower environments on the left-hand side talk directly to production. Let staging be that man in the middle, that person in the middle that handles the syncing to production, but also handles the change coming from downstream, from the dev, from UAT, from SIT, from QA. Have this be your source control mechanism. It looks a lot like a a kind of a source controlled pipeline if you're talking about moving some code through some things. But the same thing is possible with data. Just pick that solution, pick that environment somewhere in the middle. That way production is protected, staging is in sync, and then staging becomes that catch-all for those changes that are coming back up the pipeline there. So just a little bit on source control. We'll see a little bit of this in action towards the end of the webinar today as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jay, for jumping in there. So I touched on creating a checklist a little bit earlier. It sounds super simple, right? It's like we've talked about the complexities of data migration and data migration projects and governance plans. But at the end of the day, create a checklist. I'll tell you why, because this is a way to track the work that you did if you do need to go back and do that post-mortem. It's a very simple way that any someone maybe who is on the peripheral of the project can understand the steps that are being taken. This is something where if you've got maybe an admin that is more of a junior level and does not have the experience to grasp the concept of the larger data migration plan. Maybe the tool you're using is really difficult and they're not really hands-on with it anyway, but they're still part of this project and they still have roles, or they still have responsibilities within the role they're playing for the data governance plan itself or a project. So, really what you want to do is once you've just built out this grand thing that is your governance plan and your project, or your data migration project plan, then you want to go back and simplify it a little bit. I find this to be the easiest way to share, the information, or these are your action items, let's put it this way, that the people that are doing the project need to follow. So this way, as an owner, as a lead, as a manager in the project, you can see this allows people to collaborate. You can see where you're at. You can see, maybe it's a good way to evaluate. There's a lot of reasons. Like you can evaluate at what point the bottleneck's happening. Once you're going through, if someone's going out on vacation and cannot participate in the release for the next 2 releases, you're able to pick this up real quick, plug and play. This is how it's done. So it's super important to build out that grand plan and then simplify it. And so it'll all work together that way, in a way that everybody should be able to understand that's working on the project. Getting the deployments right. Cool. So now we've done all the planning and all the fun stuff on the front end, and all we want to do is move the data, right? And we want to see this thing in action. There's a few things that you should do, right before you click the button. Begin with a small test batch. Don't deploy 10 million records if you have not ever deployed the records before. Most of us, I think, have learned that the hard way, where we've just been so excited and we feel so good about the plan and everybody loves it and we're getting high fives. And then we click the button and just things you get an error and nothing happens, or you push the data and it's not done well or not done correctly and you miss something big, right? So do a small batch. Take 5 to 10% of your records, do the thing, see what happens, do an audit, afterwards, make sure it goes well, and then you can go ahead and do the deployment. You also, which is the validation too, you always, after this whole thing, you want to go in there and make sure it actually did what you expected it to do. And not only you as the technical person, but also having someone in the business who's going to be using this data, verify that the thing is doing what they expect it to do. So again, CPQ is an example, new product rule, new price rule, whatever. Have your sales ops team or whoever, when your sales reps go in and actually go through the motion of using the new process and ensuring that it is working the way that everyone thinks it's going to work. Turning off automated workflow rules. This is a fun one. So there's a couple things here. First of all, if I said to you, okay, just go turn everything off, you'd be like, okay, that's going to take me 2 hours. That's terrible. But the reason you want to do that is for a couple of reasons. One, the data is in place in the way that you want it to be. So in theory, you shouldn't need automation to be firing off when you're inserting a bunch of new data. It should be there already with your migration. Number 2 is that when and I think a lot of you guys probably know this, but what automation in Salesforce is just like a butterfly effect. The second you update a field, if you actually look at a debug record or something like that, I mean, the thing's this long. You can see all that stuff that's firing off in your org. So if you're moving those, 10,000 records, those 10 million records, or whatever you're doing, you're firing off over and over on every single transaction. The likelihood that something's going to time out or that you're going to get an error is going to, and all that stuff's going to affect your deployment. So what you want to do is efficiently do the deployment, turn off the workflows, which I'll give you a hack in just a second. But importantly, you want to, do this when your users are not online if possible. So if you're, if doing it on the weekend is the best, I mean, honestly, you can set that up to do on the weekend or do it in the evening, or when, the point is when there's not a lot of people in there making changes that could get missed by automation not running. So you try to avoid that, lower that risk there. Something else that's just that pro tip is in all of your automation, go in and put a checkbox. And this checkbox says run this. So when you are using a tool, which is similar to something that Jay is going to talk about, but you can always say, don't run this if this checkbox is not checked. And then you check the checkbox. You can do that using I think a custom permission set's the way I've done it before. But anyway, if you shut that off, nothing will run at all. So that's a cool way to turn off your automated workflows in bulk and then check the box and they all turn back on. You're actually not turning anything on or off. You're just telling the automation to either run or not run in any given situation. So something you definitely want to do to get the deployment right, do it in an efficient manner, do it when there's not a lot of people online. So you're lowering your risk, test it first, validate it after, and that's sort of how you do that deployment. All right, last thing I'll talk about today is data skew. This is something that I would say most small to medium-sized organizations don't have to worry about too much. But once you start getting into a solid process where you're moving data around often, you are going to see these issues start to come up. I mean, there's a whole certification in Salesforce that focuses a lot around data, particularly data skew. There's a ton of best practice information out there that you could look up. One thing is you don't want to have more than 10,000 child records related to an account record. Because what happens with data skew, you see it a lot definitely with accounts, and then any records or objects that have a lot of lookups, and ownership data skew as well. And this comes down a lot of the time to roles and sharing settings in Salesforce. So if you have a complex sharing model, this is something you may see more often as well. So avoiding records being, so basically here's some ways to skirt around data skew. Avoid records being owned by a generic system user. It's a dumping ground, right? So you've solved for everything except that one thing where none of the records fit. You just kind of want to assign them off to the side so no users have to look at them. And then what happens over time is that user owns like a whole lot of records, and that's when you start running into problems, because as you're going through all of these motions and automations in Salesforce, like I said earlier, the transactions firing off, you're asking the system to do a lot, and eventually it's just not going to be able to handle it anymore. Do things like use round robin logic to evenly distribute records across users. So could be for opportunities, it could be for leads. Like you want to try to just even out that field in terms of the quantity of record ownership. Again, removing old records from the system. So that's going to reduce the number overall of data in the system, which is going to help with data skew. Consider that open sharing model. If that's a possibility for your business to have public read or write as your default, which is the opposite of a complex sharing model, if you can get away with that, it's a lot easier. And the reason is, let's say you can shut off the automation all you want, data skew is still a concern. It's not considered automation. So when you're inserting a bunch of records, you will trigger sharing rules and visibility to run and evaluate. So if you have a complex sharing model, that's that much more stuff that Salesforce has to do when you're moving records, like account records, like opportunity records, things like that. It doesn't matter what kind of record, just depends on your sharing model. So if you can open it wide up, that's just less stuff that Salesforce has to do when you're moving data. Otherwise, if you can't, you need to take into consideration the tax it's going to take on your system when you're moving records. limit automation as much as possible, remove unnecessary code. That's like the other thing that we all wish we could do is like, man, I'd love to get in there and just reconfigure all of our automation, because it piles up, your tech debt piles up. So it is worth the time. You can make the argument to the business that it is worth your time to go in there and do an audit on your automation. Everything declarative, everything code, and see what do you still need, what don't you need, what can you consolidate, and what can you make more efficient with that consolidation. It's a big project. It's another example. May want to use a good consultant if you can find one. Otherwise, dedicate a resource internally, give them a couple of months to go in, do that audit, and the more efficiently your system's running, the less data skew you'll see when you're doing these projects. And then, using pickless fields to cut back on a number of records of relationships in the system. The thing about lookups and relationships is that, you're essentially asking Salesforce to go do something, and you're not necessarily doing that with a pickless field. So the less you're asking Salesforce to go do overall when you're moving data, the less skew you'll see, the less system resources are going to be hit, the less automation or validation rules could go wrong, duplicate rules. There's just a whole lot to Salesforce, That's why we're all here. There's a lot to learn and understand. So understanding, I think, the idea of data skew is another thing where there's a lot of best practices out there. Can't recall if I said that earlier or not, but if I didn't, go out there and read about them. Look into that certification. It's an interesting topic and it's really important. So the less you can ask Salesforce to do anytime you do something, I think a general, you're better off that way.
All right, thank you so much, Reese. And before I let Jay kind of speak to how Prodly is going to could make your life a little easier, not just relational data, but throughout your whole release management process, I'd love to know if you're actually currently using a deployment tool. So launch another poll to see. And Jay, as soon as you're ready, let me know.
All right, ready on my end. So close this one out and I will take over from that spot. Shannon.
Perfect. And as far as answers go, we are pretty evenly split between yes, no, and not yet, but I would like to.
Nice. All right, let's see which one it took. All right, taking the one in the middle, share this. Move this over real quick. All right, so essentially here, as I go back in and move this panel out of my way, we have the ability to do a lot of the things Reese has been talking about here. So the Prodly approach to this and how does Prodly address this? Or we're looking at the ways to choose what data to move. So this goes back to the governance plan. How do we plan to be successful up front? There's a lot of questions. Who's going to do it? What are we going to move? Where is the data now? Where does it need to go to? The Prodly approach is all about easily choosing what data to migrate, never having to worry about how to do it, not doing those uploads and those downloads for all those child relationships, grandchild, great-grandchild relationships, parent, great-grandparent, grandparent, where you're going from the Excel route on the left-hand side to a UI, or essentially you pick where's the source, where's the destination, what data you're going to move, hitting the deploy button, also doing a little preloading to see what's going to happen during that deployment. You'll see more of this in action here. Some of the use cases not being tied into one thing, the Salesforce clouds, sales, service, field service, lightning, commerce in there, revenue, that's CPQ. Release management, we're talking about sandbox seeding, SOX compliance, Scratch orgs, other app exchange apps out there, Conga, where I spent a decade prior to coming to Prodly, Rootstock, Viva, Encino, TaskRay, Financial Force, other large applications that are very data heavy that would be honestly an unmanageable process to try and move by hand and keep in sync between some environments. The other piece here is, it's a time to and an ongoing value. Prodly's up and running in days, not months, not years in here. It's an intuitive experience in Salesforce. We invest right back in our customers, multiple dedicated resource, regular meetings, support, market-driven development on an agile. We're pushing things out every 2 or 3 weeks. Everyone's getting the benefit of new features, new functionality, new enhancements that are in there. And that's the way we're going to market right now, making sure our customers are served, resources, and on the product side. It's just not about moving data either. It's an entire platform. It's an end-to-end DevOps solution. We're talking about work management, sandbox management, releases, regression testing, compliance. It's being able to move data. It's being able to manage environments. It's being able to use source control. It's a full platform DevOps on the Salesforce platform built for Salesforce users. That's really what Prodly is bringing to market. When it comes to data, nobody does it better. And that's where most of the focus is going to be here when I flip over into the actual demo in just a moment. We dangled this carrot a little bit earlier, source control using version control right now, where you actually have a repo, a GitHub or an Azure or a Bitbucket. You're using that repo to actually back up some data. So you talk about backup, mission critical data that's user selected, that's admin selected, that's you selected, the people on this call right now in this webinar, choosing what data is critical to the ongoing success of your business, making sure you have a backup location, and then making sure you can actually use that as well to push down into other environments. You can back up production, so you have a rollback. You can use that data to fill in your staging, your partial sandboxes, your dev sandboxes. If you want your full sandbox to be in sync, you can schedule some deployments with Prodly. Maybe you can do less refreshes and you end up avoiding some stale data in there, because every night you're pushing new records or updated records into your full sandbox or maybe into your partial. So some other good use cases about using data migration to maintain that compliance, maintain that up to date, and just prevent some of that stale nature of an unrefreshed sandbox happening. So what does this actually look like in action? Now, you'll see here, you've got some records that have happened, but let me go flip over and answer some of these things live, what this actually looks like. First and foremost, we're in Salesforce. Talked about it being on the platform for the platform users. That's what this is. I'm just looking at some dashboards. Starting at the end here, so here's some of the stats I've done. I've done some deployments before, who's done them, where have they been done, what records have been moved. All of this is reportable. All of it is dashboardable in Salesforce because this is all tracked and maintained right in my Salesforce instance. Back to that early governance slide where planning is key. Well, this is answering the question of where is the data now and where does it need to get to? I've got a bunch of environments. I've got my production here, a bunch of dev, a partial sandbox, dev pro, full, whatever your environment structure is. You just tell us what you're looking to add as an endpoint. Is it a nickname? Is this full? Is this full 2? Is it pre-prod? Is it a sandbox? Is it another production environment? So if you're working in a multi-production environment where you've got maybe 2 entities under one umbrella and they both have their own environment, you can move data between them as well. 2 productions, hit the add button, give it some credentials, log in. You've now answered the question of where is data now and where does it need to go to? The next piece when you're planning this out is, okay, what data do I actually want to move? And in Prodly lingo here, that is known as a data set. As my list view pops back up, we have a bunch. These are pre-built, ready to go. I'm going to focus on the one for today, this data migration best practices. This answers the question of, okay, I've got my accounts and contacts. Oh, also opportunities and maybe cases and opportunity line items. That mission critical data that I want or that project data that I need, it's all the same to Prodly. We don't have to do an Excel file download, upload, get the new record IDs, remap it with VLOOKUPs. Prodly's handling all of that ID information in there and all of the relationships as we wait for Salesforce Lightning to load here. I have been around long enough now to have absorbed a joke that one of my partners at the time was calling it Salesforce molasses. Just kidding, it's gotten much, much better over the last few years here. But this answers the question of what data we're going to move. And this is a schema view here where I've got accounts to look at. I've got my best practices, my contacts, my tasks, the opportunities. If I want to mask any of this data, so that data masking piece, that's handled here at the field level. If I click into my contacts and take a look at what's going on at the field level, at my contact level, very typically something you don't need exact or don't want exact data in a sandbox, I can come in here and actually just mask out things like their name. I can tuck .invalid to the end of their email address. So if I put this data in a sandbox, I don't run the risk of one of those workflows not being turned off in emailing all of my users. If I want to mask the first name, I can come in here and we'll randomize that value and we'll put a legible but random name on there when we push that data in. GDPR, California rules, they're representative but not exact data that's going on in there. So some ways that we handle the actual deployment of what type of data, masking that data. When we go in and actually do a deployment, here's probably the best part. I'm doing this one time through, not multiple times per object. So I'm going to come back here and I'm going to push some data down into this dev sandbox, whatever it is. It can go any direction with the data. All we need to know is it's a source or a destination. In this case, it's a destination. I'm going to push data down from whatever. This could be my staging. Remember that schema we had before where production and staging are talking but not talking to the rest. So I can push data from my staging environment in there, my partial sandbox. I choose what data to move. Here's my best practice data. I give it a nice name, best practice deployment. I hit the deploy button. Prodly handles the remapping, the reparenting, all of the external IDs we might need moving forward. Prodly is doing all of this. It's going to kick this off. And at the end, you're going to get some results here that you can go back and check. Here's that last piece, verify what you've done. So we can come back here and easily verify all of the records that were involved in this. Instead of having a whole bunch of spot checking to do, Prodly is going to give us those eyes, that spot checking on the process. And we're going to see a bunch of data, same exact data set I pushed to a different box. You can see we're doing inserts, we're doing updates, what records actually have happened, any issues that might have been encountered. Maybe we left a validation rule on, maybe a workflow rule was on that changed something, or some trigger changed some records. But we can get all the way down to spot checking those individual records here as well. So just a quick look at the approach Prodly takes, all of those things that Reese brought up today. Prodly was built from probably the most complex data structure, CPQ, and we've carried that through all of the data systems, the field service lighting, all of those other clouds. But here's that final look at the results here when you're spot checking, giving you the link from the record we took, the record we created, quickly check into a few of these and check and make sure that everything looks as it should to verify, do that final check here. There should be a small subset in testing, pushing to maybe an empty dev sandbox. But once you're happy with those small subset of records, you can go and push that whole piece in there. Last thing is we have the same thing we can do by pushing this up into a repo. If you need full backup, that full disaster recovery for some selected objects in here, those 30, 50, maybe 75 objects that are mission critical to run your business. Something goes wrong, you've got all your rollbacks, all of your data can be stored up here. You can quickly access that and get it back into your environment. So a very quick walkthrough of some Prodly approaches to this at the very end, but I did want to bring this up, give everybody a chance to see this, and kind of turn it back over at this point for any closing thoughts that might happen and the end of the presentation here.
Yeah, and while I have you, Jay, we do have a question from Joe, and he says, I know this is all about data best practices, but how could Prodly help when I have some new fields, new list values that are part of my data?
Yeah, so Prodly as a platform here, that's the idea as well. This was about data. Right? We talked about data today. Reese went through data. I looked at the data side, but Prodly's got a solution to help you move your metadata as well. They're two sides of the same coin. Prodly can help you in a much better way than a change set. Change sets have been around for, I don't know, it's the dinosaur of Salesforce migration technology probably. We have the option to help you either with source control, move those pick list values around. Best practice says, make sure your schemas match before you move data. If you've got some fields in your source that aren't in your destination yet, first thing to do is use Prodly to help you move those new fields, those new pick list values, then go and move your data. Otherwise, you're going to leave some of that behind. You're going to end up with that data skew that Reese was talking about. Prodly's got the solution to help you move your metadata as well.
Awesome. All right. Thank you again, Jay. Thank you, Reese, for me today.
For sure.
And to everybody, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Yeah.
keep an eye out for the recording and further resources and valuable information that is coming your way regarding data migration and potentially how Prodly can help. It's 12 on the dot, so I think we'll call it a day. Thank you again, and hope to see you next time.
Thanks all.
Thanks,
Cheers.
everyone.